My husband posted poolside photos from a five-star resort while I stood at our daughter's funeral. He texted that he was in a meeting and would call later. I checked the location tag and saw the resort name. That was the moment I stopped crying and started planning. I pulled our bank records, found the secret card, and saved every receipt. I also found the woman's name. Before the burial dirt settled, I had proof, a plan, and a deadline. He thought he was untouchable. By sunset, he would learn who booked his return ticket. The day of the funeral felt unreal, as if the world had lost its color. People surrounded me with flowers, whispers, and soft touches, but none of it reached me. My husband's absence was louder than any prayer being said. I looked at the small casket and wondered how a man could choose luxury over loss, cocktails over his child. I wanted to believe he had a reason, but deep down I already knew the truth. My daughter's grave was fresh, and so was the sting of betrayal that grew sharper with every second. When everyone began to leave, I stayed behind. The pastor offered comfort, but I couldn't hear him. My phone buzzed again. Another message from him, same excuse. Important meeting. His words felt like a slap. My eyes caught the location tag under the text, and everything inside me went still. It wasn't a meeting room. It was a luxury resort by the ocean. While I was burying our daughter, he was lounging under palm trees, sipping expensive wine. My grief twisted into something darker, a cold anger that pushed the tears away. Driving home from the cemetery, I couldn't feel the road. My hands stayed clenched around the steering wheel, my mind looping the image of him laughing somewhere warm while I drove behind a hearse. Every excuse he'd given suddenly sounded hollow. Late nights, canceled flights, projects that needed him. It all made sense now. He had left us long before Grace took her last breath. I parked in the driveway, stared at the house, and realized I couldn't stay a grieving wife anymore. I had to become something else, something that could fight back. The first thing I did was go to Grace's room. Her toys sat perfectly arranged on the shelves. Her favorite stuffed rabbit rested against the pillow. The smell of her shampoo lingered in the air. My chest ached, but I didn't cry. Not yet. I closed the door gently and leaned against it, feeling the full weight of her absence. He hadn't even been there to say goodbye. The man who once promised the world to her couldn't spare a single day to stand beside her coffin. That thought burned deeper than any grief could. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and logged into our shared account. For months, he had claimed money was tight. He said business was slow, that he was sacrificing for us. Yet the numbers told another story. Large withdrawals, all marked as work expenses. The dates matched his supposed business trips. There were receipts for hotel stays, dinners, and boutique purchases. Each one felt like another stab in the back. My hands trembled as I scrolled through his financial trail, realizing I hadn't lost just a husband. I had lost my trust completely. Scrolling through his credit card records, I found something new, a second card under his name. One I didn't know existed. The charges told a clear story: flights, spa, packages, fine dining, and in one transaction, the name of a second guest appeared. Lena, a woman half my age. She was tagged in one of his resort photos, smiling with him in the background. My stomach churned, but I saved everything. Screenshots, receipts, bank statements. This was no mistake. This was betrayal, documented and undeniable. He had built a fantasy life while I was drowning in real pain. As the night deepened, I stared at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. My face looked different, older, harder. The grief that had weighed me down was turning into something stronger. I wasn't going to beg for answers or forgiveness. I was going to make sure every lie he'd told came crashing down on him. He had taken our daughter's final moments and replaced them with vacations and champagne. Now, I would take from him everything he thought was safe. This wasn't revenge. This was justice written in the language he understood best: loss. I made a folder on my computer named Truth. Inside, I stored every file, every photo, every transaction. Each new discovery added to the fire inside me. I printed copies and placed them neatly in a binder. I wanted him to see how organized his destruction was. Every dollar spent on deceit would now become a weapon against him. When I finally closed the laptop, the house was silent. I looked around and realized how empty life had become since Grace died. But the emptiness wasn't going to consume me anymore. It was going to fuel me. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Grace's last smile. She had asked for her father, but he never showed. I had told her he was working, that he loved her. Now I knew I had lied to my dying child. The thought tore through me like glass. I sat up, wiped my tears, and whispered to myself that I would not let his absence be the final story Grace left behind. Her memory deserved better. My pain needed a purpose, and that purpose was already forming in my mind. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. My eyes burned from crying, but my resolve was clear. I began making calls to the bank, to his office, to anyone who could confirm where he really was. His assistant said he was away for an extended business meeting. The same lie again. I thanked her and hung up, my patience gone. He thought he could live 2 lives without consequence. He thought I was too broken to notice. He was wrong. My grief had stripped away fear. What remained was focus, and that was far more dangerous. After breakfast, I drove to his office building and sat in the parking lot. I watched employees come and go. His car wasn't there. I checked the company's online calendar. His name wasn't listed for any meeting. He wasn't working. He hadn't been for months. The pattern was obvious now. Each business trip was just another getaway. I took a deep breath and made a decision. I couldn't rely on my instincts alone. I needed professional help. If he could hire lawyers to hide money, I could hire someone to uncover it. I made my first call that afternoon. The woman I found was a private investigator named Eleanor. Her reputation was spotless, her reviews promising. I explained everything in a steady voice, though inside, I was trembling. She didn't judge me or ask unnecessary questions. She simply said she'd start right away. That night, I sat by the window, listening to the quiet. Somewhere out there, he was laughing, unaware that the walls around him were beginning to crumble. I wondered how long it would take before he realized the comfort he'd stolen was now the very thing that would destroy him. 2 days later, Eleanor called with updates. Her tone was calm, but her words cut deep. He wasn't just spending our money, he was stealing from his own company. He had been moving funds into fake accounts, labeling them as vendor payments. Each withdrawal matched the dates of his luxury vacations. I thanked her and hung up, feeling both vindicated and sick. I had proof now, proof that he had betrayed not only our marriage, but his entire life's work. It wasn't enough to confront him yet, but it was enough to make him fall. That evening, I sat at Grace's old desk and wrote everything down. Dates, amounts, names, locations. I created a map of his deception, line by line. With each note, I felt less like a victim and more like someone taking back control. He thought I'd break under the weight of grief. He thought I'd fade quietly. But I was stronger than the story he had written for me. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had everything ready: evidence, purpose, a plan. All I needed now was the right moment to confront him face to face. The next morning, I looked at my phone and saw another text from him. It was casual, thoughtless, like nothing had happened. Back soon, big deal closing. I stared at the screen and smiled, not with affection, but with certainty. He had no idea what was waiting for him. I deleted the message and opened my planner. On the last page, I wrote the date I would confront him. Then I closed it, placed my hand over Grace's photo, and whispered that it was time. He had chosen paradise over his family. I was choosing truth over him. By morning, my kitchen table looked like a crime board. Papers, screenshots, and bank records were spread in neat stacks. Every time I found another lie, I labeled it in red ink. It was no longer about understanding why he did it, only about proving that he did. His pattern was clear, predictable, and arrogant. He thought distance made him invisible. I printed every document, placed them in order, and slipped them into a folder marked evidence. For the first time since Grace's death, I felt like I had control over something. I decided to move carefully, the way he had taught me without realizing it. He had built this secret life in silence. I would destroy it the same way. I spent the day checking more of his accounts, including his company's shared drives. That was when I noticed files with strange vendor names. They weren't real businesses. The invoices matched the money missing from our account. He wasn't just lying to me. He was stealing from his job too. I saved everything. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted his entire world to collapse under the truth. That night, I couldn't stop scrolling through photos of him and Lena. They looked like tourists, sunburned, smiling, holding cocktails. I stared at their faces, not in jealousy, but disbelief. How could someone who held our dying daughter's hand now look this carefree? I realized then that I didn't want him to just lose money or status. I wanted him to face what I had faced, to feel powerless, to lose everything that made him believe he was above pain. This wasn't only about betrayal anymore, it was about justice for Grace. The next morning, Eleanor called again. Her voice was calm and precise, like she was reading from a report. She confirmed that the false vendors linked back to a single offshore account in his name. That account funded every resort stay, every shopping spree, every dinner. It was undeniable proof. I thanked her and hung up. For a long moment, I just sat there in silence, letting the reality sink in. My husband had used our daughter's hospital money to live a double life. He had taken her suffering and turned it into his luxury. I went into Grace's room again and sat by her bed. My mind was spinning, but my heart felt strangely steady. I whispered that her mother had everything she needed now. The time for crying was over. The time for action had come. I opened my phone and typed a short message to Eleanor, asking her to collect every remaining piece of evidence within the week. Before we continue and see what happens next, please make sure to like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you know and keeps stories like this alive. Over the next few days, I barely slept. My home had turned into a war room. I labeled envelopes, organized timelines, and prepared duplicate copies of every file. I even bought a small fireproof safe to store one set. Eleanor sent me daily updates, each more revealing than the last. She uncovered travel records showing he had booked a flight for two, him and Lena, to another country. Their destination was listed as Italy. He had planned to move there permanently. He wasn't just avoiding responsibility, he was running from it completely. When Eleanor sent me a copy of one of his emails, I felt my stomach twist. It was addressed to Lena. In it he wrote that once everything is finalized, they could start over, free of any burden. I stared at the line until it blurred. Burden. That's what he called his wife and dead child. I printed the email, added it to my growing file, and placed it on top. He was right about one thing. He would never look back, because I would make sure he wouldn't have a future to look toward either. That night, I walked through the house, turning off lights one by one. Every corner reminded me of what used to be. A family, laughter, warmth. But those memories didn't bring comfort anymore. They burned. I stopped at a framed picture on the hallway wall, the three of us smiling at Grace's 5th birthday party. My husband had his arm around me, pretending to be the perfect father. I took the photo down, placed it face down on the table, and left it there. The illusion was gone. Only truth and consequence remained now. The next morning, Eleanor handed me the full report in a sealed envelope. Inside were spreadsheets, photos, and transcripts of messages. Everything was detailed and undeniable. His world of lies was fully exposed on paper. As I flipped through the pages, I felt strangely calm. There was no satisfaction, no joy, just clarity. I had all I needed to end his facade, but I couldn't just hand it to the police. Not yet. He needed to see it himself first. He needed to understand what it felt like to have his life crumble in front of him. I sat at my desk and wrote a message to him. My hands didn't shake this time. I told him I wanted to talk, that I had been thinking about us and needed closure. I said we should meet at the vacation house for the weekend to reconnect. I read the message twice before hitting send. Within minutes, he replied with a cheerful yes. He even added a smiley face at the end, like everything was fine. He had no idea that the house where he'd once lied to me would soon become the place of his undoing. In the days leading up to the meeting, I prepared every detail. I printed extra copies of documents, arranged them in order, and rehearsed what I would say. I contacted a lawyer quietly, explaining the situation without giving too much away. She told me to keep my evidence safe and document every conversation. I thanked her and ended the call, feeling ready for whatever came next. I wasn't scared anymore. The woman who had cried at her daughter's grave was gone. The one who would walk into that meeting was someone new. I went to the vacation house a day early. The drive felt endless, but I needed the time to prepare myself. The place looked exactly as I remembered it. White walls, glass windows, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the deck. Grace had once built sand castles there. The memory hit hard, but I stayed focused. I unpacked my folders and spread them across the dining table. Each sheet represented a truth he couldn't talk his way out of. I connected my laptop to the television, queued up the video of Grace smiling, and waited for morning. That night, the sound of the ocean filled the quiet house. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the horizon. I knew I wouldn't sleep. Tomorrow would change everything. I thought about Grace, about how much she had believed in her father. She had waited for him until the very end. That thought gave me strength. I told myself this confrontation wasn't about hatred anymore. It was about closure, about showing him the cost of every choice he made while pretending to be a husband and a father. The morning came with a strange calm. I dressed simply, tied my hair back, and laid out the documents neatly on the table. The sunlight hit the folder labeled Proof, turning it into the centerpiece of the room. I placed my phone beside it, ready to record everything for my lawyer if needed. I poured myself a glass of water and took a slow breath. The house was silent, except for the sound of waves crashing outside. It felt like the calm before a storm I had created and was finally ready to face. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message. It was him. He said he was on his way, asked if I needed anything from the store. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. I didn't need anything. He was bringing exactly what I wanted: his arrogance, his confidence, his lies. I stepped outside onto the porch and looked toward the road. The wind carried the faint smell of salt and seaweed. Somewhere beyond the curve, his car would appear soon. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready, completely ready. When I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel, my heart didn't race. Instead, everything inside me went quiet. His car stopped near the steps, and I watched him step out, dressed casually in light colors, sunglasses on, smiling like a man with no worries. He waved at me, and I forced myself to wave back. He thought this was a reunion. He thought I had softened, that belief would be his final comfort. I turned and walked back inside, letting the screen door close behind me, and waited for him to follow. Inside the house, I could hear his footsteps approach. He entered with a bright grin, greeting me, as if nothing was wrong. I motioned toward the kitchen, where the table was set. He followed, still chatting, unaware of the evidence laid neatly before him. The folders, the laptop, the printed photos, everything waited quietly, like witnesses ready to speak. I sat across from him, folded my hands, and met his eyes. For the first time, I didn't see the man I married. I saw the man who had chosen himself over everyone else. He sat down, still wearing that smug, comfortable expression. He poured himself a glass of water and talked about work, pretending to be busy and important. I let him talk. Every word felt like noise from a stranger. When he finally paused, I slid the first folder toward him. He frowned, confused, and opened it. His smile began to fade. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The papers spoke for me. Hotel receipts, wire transfers, and invoices marked vendor services. His hands stopped moving. The silence between us grew heavier than words ever could. He tried to recover, muttering excuses about work, about stress, about misunderstanding. I listened, unmoved. Then I reached for another folder and placed it beside the first. Inside were photos of him and Lena, taken at the same resorts he had billed as business trips. I watched his face drain of color. He pushed the papers away, but I kept sliding more toward him. His world was laid out piece by piece, each document a reflection of his own greed. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just let the truth fill the room. Finally, I stood and picked up the remote. With one click, the television came to life. Grace's laughter filled the room, her little voice echoing through the walls. She was blowing bubbles in the backyard, giggling as they floated around her. He froze, his eyes locked on the screen, I watched him shift in his seat, unable to look away. The sight of her should have brought warmth, but it only exposed the emptiness between us. This was what he had missed, what he had traded for sunbeds and cocktails. As the video continued, I said nothing. The images of Grace played one after another. Her birthday candles, her drawings, her smile. I watched his shoulders sink as guilt began to show. He covered his face for a moment, then looked at me with eyes that begged for sympathy. I had none left to give. Every tear I once had was gone. I turned the volume down and pointed to the stack of papers beside him. That was his life now. Not a family man, not a husband, not a father, just a man caught by his own lies. He tried to speak again, but his words were weak, his tone pleading. Wah. I didn't respond. I had heard enough lies to last a lifetime. I picked up another folder, this one containing the email he had written to Lena about moving abroad. I placed it in front of him, my movements steady. His eyes widened as he read it. The realization hit him. There was no more room for denial. His escape plan was exposed. Every secret he thought buried was sitting between us, printed in black and white. The silence after that felt final. I stood and walked toward the window, letting him sit with his guilt. Outside, the sea looked endless, the sunlight glinting off the water. It reminded me of Grace's eyes. I turned back to face him. He looked smaller now, fragile even. I thought of all the nights I'd spent alone in the hospital, begging him to come home, and how he had chosen to look away. That memory hardened something inside me. Whatever pity remained evaporated. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about ending the story he thought he controlled. He asked if I was going to ruin him. The words sounded desperate, cracked. I didn't answer. I simply nodded toward the folder that held copies of his embezzlement records. That was all the answer he needed. He put his head in his hands and let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, but close. I didn't feel triumph. I only felt the weight of finality. The man who once stood tall in every room was reduced to a whisper of himself, surrounded by the proof of his own corruption. I gathered the folders, closed each one, and stacked them neatly again. I told him it was over, that everything he built on lies would come apart on its own. Then I turned off the television. The last frame of Grace's smiling face disappeared into black. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard him call my name, but I didn't look back. The sound of waves swallowed his voice. The confrontation was done. The next step was justice, and I was ready to make sure he faced it. When I got into my car and looked back at the house, I saw him standing by the window. He looked lost, holding his head in his hands. For years he had made me believe he was untouchable, but now he stood surrounded by proof of his own destruction. The ocean wind carried away the last traces of pity I had. I started the car and drove off, leaving behind the man who had buried his own future the same way I had buried our daughter. For the first time in months, I felt strong. Driving home, I thought of the road ahead. I had shown him the truth, but that wasn't enough. He needed to face consequences beyond shame. I didn't want an apology or explanations. I wanted accountability. I called Eleanor again, telling her it was time to move forward with the final step. She didn't ask questions. She knew what I meant. Her calm assurance reminded me that justice doesn't always arrive in courtrooms. It sometimes begins in silence, with a single call made by a mother who had lost everything. The following morning, I reviewed every document one last time. I made copies, labeled them neatly, and sealed them in separate envelopes. One set went to my lawyer, another to the company board. The final one, I kept locked in my safe. I wanted to make sure he couldn't twist his way out this time. I had trusted him once, and watched him ruin everything. This time, I would trust only myself. My hands didn't tremble anymore. They moved with purpose, each paper folded like a piece of closure taking shape. Eleanor called to confirm the files were sent. Her tone carried quiet satisfaction. She had also reported the embezzlement to a corporate contact who could launch an internal investigation. I thanked her. When the call ended, I sat in stillness. It felt strange to realize that the wheels of justice were already turning. He would soon discover that the damage wasn't only emotional, it was legal, irreversible, and public. For the first time, the consequences he'd tried to avoid were heading straight toward him, faster than he could ever imagine. 2 days later, I got an anonymous email from someone at his company. It said there were meetings happening behind closed doors, and that his name was on every document being reviewed. They were checking his accounts, tracing transactions, and questioning employees. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. I didn't smile or cry. I just exhaled. The truth had finally escaped the walls he built around it. He thought he could buy time, but time was the one thing he no longer had. His downfall was now officially in motion. That evening, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The sunset painted the room in gold, a color I hadn't noticed in months. The quiet didn't hurt anymore. It felt clean, as if the house itself was finally breathing again. I realized I didn't want to spend my life angry. I wanted to spend it free. Grace's photo sat on the table beside me, her smile still bright. I told her in my mind that justice was finally on its way, for both of us, for everything he took. The next morning, Eleanor called again. Her tone was sharper this time. The company had launched a full investigation. They had already discovered multiple offshore transfers and fake vendor accounts. He had been suspended pending review. They planned to contact law enforcement within days. I listened quietly, my hands resting on the table. I thought of how hard I had cried for him once, how I had begged him to come home when Grace was sick. Now, I felt nothing but relief. For once, it wasn't me drowning in consequences. It was him. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't have to. His silence was loud enough. The man who never stopped talking suddenly had nothing to say. I imagined him pacing, trying to piece together how everything unraveled so quickly. He would suspect someone but never guess I had done it alone. That was my victory. Not his destruction, but my control over it. I didn't shout, threaten, or plead. I just pressed send on a few emails and let the truth do the rest. Power could be quiet too. When the news finally broke online, I saw his name trending. Headlines mentioned fraud, stolen funds, and luxury trips funded by company money. His photo appeared beside words like scandal and embezzlement. The comments poured in fast, each one chipping away at the image he had spent years crafting. I didn't share it, didn't like or comment. I simply watched. The world was finally seeing what I had lived with. The perfect husband, the successful businessman. It had all been an illusion, and illusions don't survive in daylight. By evening, my phone started buzzing non-stop. Friends, coworkers, and distant relatives wanted to talk. Some said they couldn't believe it. Others wanted details. I ignored every call. People weren't looking for truth. They were looking for gossip. I wasn't going to be a part of that. This was my story, my pain, not entertainment. I muted my phone, sat back on the couch, and closed my eyes. The noise outside was fading. The storm I had started was spreading on its own, and I didn't need to fan the flames anymore. The next morning, I walked to the park near our house. I hadn't been there since Grace passed away. The trees were bare, the benches damp from last night's rain. Still, it felt peaceful. I sat for a while, breathing in the cold air. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by the thought of him. I thought about Grace instead. Her laugh, her tiny hand holding mine. I told myself she would be proud that I didn't let her father's betrayal destroy me. I had turned pain into something powerful. When I got home, Eleanor had left me a voicemail. Her words were clear. Law enforcement had officially taken over the case. Evidence had been forwarded, and charges were being prepared. I listened to her calm voice and felt a strange kind of peace. Justice wasn't fast, but it was steady. I imagined him sitting in his office when the investigators arrived, watching the realization spread across his face. For every time I had begged for help and been ignored, life was finally answering on my behalf. That thought was enough. 2 days later, I saw footage online of him being escorted from his office. No handcuffs yet, just tension in his posture, embarrassment in his eyes. The photo captured everything, the fall of a man who thought he was above everyone else. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't need to. The image was already burned into my mind. That was the same face that had once smiled at me across candlelit dinners. Now it was the face of consequence. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It arrives quietly, carrying every broken promise on its back. The following week, I received an email from his company's board. They thanked me anonymously for the evidence and assured me it would remain confidential. I didn't reply. I didn't need their gratitude. I hadn't done this for them. I had done it for Grace. My only satisfaction came from knowing that his empire was crumbling because of the truth he had tried to bury. Somewhere, he was sitting in silence, watching the life he built turn to dust. I hoped that silence lasted a long time. When his arrest was finally made public, it hit every news outlet. Words like executive scandal and corporate fraud flashed across every headline. I didn't watch the full report. I already knew how it would go. Cameras, questions, chaos. The man who once demanded attention now wanted to disappear. And he would, behind walls, away from cameras, stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. I made tea and sat by the window. The house was quiet, but this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. The storm had passed. He tried calling me from jail. The number appeared several times over the next few days. I never answered. What could he possibly say now? There were no words left to fix what he had broken. I let the phone ring each time until it stopped. I knew what he wanted. Someone to blame, someone to beg, but I was done being that person. I had spent too many nights waiting for calls that never came. Now it was his turn to wait, to sit in silence and face the life he had chosen. When I finally listened to one of his voicemails, I heard panic in his voice. He said he was sorry, that he didn't mean for it to go this far, that he wanted to explain. I deleted it halfway through. Sorry was easy to say when the walls closed in. Real remorse would have meant being there when Grace needed him. Real love would have meant staying. He didn't get to rewrite the story now that it no longer favored him. I pressed delete again, and never checked the messages after that. Days turned into weeks. His name began to fade from headlines, replaced by newer scandals. But for me, the peace stayed. The house no longer felt haunted by the past. I opened the curtains every morning, cooked breakfast, and even played soft music again. Small things, but they felt like victories. I wasn't defined by what he had done anymore. My life was no longer a reaction to his choices. I was living for myself and for Grace, who deserved to be remembered with light, not with shadows. I sold the vacation house soon after, the same house where he had lied and smiled and built his fantasy. The money from the sale didn't feel like profit. It felt like closure. I decided to donate part of it to a local children's hospital. It was the first time I had felt peace in giving something away. Grace's name would be placed on the donor wall. The thought of that made me smile. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was remembrance. Something beautiful born from everything that had gone wrong. As time passed, I started to rebuild. I focused on routines that brought comfort. I cooked the meals Grace had loved, walked in places we used to visit, and wrote letters I would never send. I didn't hide from memories anymore. They hurt, but they also reminded me of what real love looked like, the kind that never leaves, even when life does. The man who ruined everything could never touch that again. Grace's memory was mine alone, and it was untouchable. That thought gave me more strength than revenge ever could. I decided to create something lasting in her name. It started as a small idea, a fund to help parents of sick children who couldn't afford treatment. I reached out to hospitals and community groups, explaining my vision. People responded with kindness. Some had stories like mine. Some just wanted to help. Donations began to arrive slowly. Each one felt like a step toward turning pain into purpose. Grace's name wasn't just a reminder of loss anymore. It was becoming a symbol of hope for others who were still fighting their battles. Working on the foundation gave me direction. The long nights that used to drown me in sadness were now filled with purpose. I spent hours organizing paperwork, reaching out to families, and planning small fundraisers. Every message I received from parents thanking me reminded me that this was the right path. I didn't need to destroy someone to find peace. I only needed to rebuild what was left of myself. Grace's name began to mean more than grief. It meant courage, kindness, and strength. Exactly what she had always been. When his trial began, reporters reached out to me again. They wanted statements, comments, reactions. I ignored them. This wasn't my story anymore. It was his consequence. I didn't attend court or follow the updates. I didn't need to. I already knew the outcome. The man who once stood above everyone else was finally facing the truth in front of strangers. That was enough for me. I turned my attention back to the foundation, where every small success reminded me that I had built something from the ashes he left behind. The more I focused on the foundation, the more alive I felt. I met other parents who had been through the same struggles, and we shared stories that connected us. Each conversation healed a small piece of me. It wasn't easy, but it was meaningful. I realized I had spent years living for someone else's approval, someone who never deserved it. Now I was living for something bigger, for grace, for the families who needed help, and for the version of myself that had once been lost but was finally found again. One night, while working late on the Foundation's first annual event, I paused and looked at a photo of Grace smiling. Her bright eyes seemed to tell me I was doing the right thing. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt alive with her memory. I thought about how far I had come, from heartbreak and betrayal to purpose and peace. I whispered a quiet promise to her that I would keep building, keep helping, and never lose faith again. This time, I wasn't surviving. I was living. Months passed quietly after the trial began. The headlines faded, the noise settled, and life started to feel normal again. My days were filled with planning, paperwork, and moments of reflection that no longer hurt the way they once did. The foundation had begun helping families in real ways, funding treatments, paying hospital bills, and offering support groups. Every thank you message I received felt like a piece of Grace's spirit shining through. Her name wasn't just remembered, it was changing lives. That thought made every sleepless night worth it. She finally had the legacy she deserved. Sometimes I would think of him, not with anger, but with distance. His name still appeared in occasional articles about the case, but I didn't read them. He was someone I used to know, a stranger wearing a face I once trusted. His world had collapsed just as I promised it would, but I didn't find joy in that. Revenge had served its purpose, and now it was just noise from a past life. What mattered was the peace I was slowly rebuilding, one honest day at a time. The foundation grew faster than I expected. Volunteers joined, local businesses offered support, and hospitals began reaching out for partnerships. I hired a small team to help manage donations and outreach. For the first time in years, I woke up with a purpose that didn't revolve around grief. It wasn't about filling a void anymore. It was about building something meaningful. Every time I signed a new form or approved funding for a child's treatment, I whispered Grace's name in my heart. She had become the reason hundreds of others had hope. One morning, I received a letter from a woman whose son had survived because of the foundation's help. She wrote that she had almost given up, but our support gave her strength to keep fighting. Her words made me cry, not from sadness, but from gratitude. Grace's life, though short, had sparked something that continued to heal others. That was the kind of immortality no money or betrayal could destroy. It reminded me that love doesn't end with loss. It only changes its form and finds new places to live. As the seasons changed, so did I. The pain that once sat heavy on my chest had softened into something else, a quiet acceptance. I visited Grace's grave every Sunday with fresh flowers, sitting by her stone and talking to her about the foundation's progress. I told her about every child we helped, every parent who smiled again. The wind always seemed to pick up when I spoke, and though I knew it was just the breeze, I let myself believe it was her way of listening. It brought me peace each time. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived, addressed in familiar handwriting. My heart skipped as I turned it over and saw his name in the corner. It had been nearly a year since I'd heard from him. I debated throwing it away, but curiosity won. I opened it carefully. Inside, he wrote that he was sorry for everything, that he thought of Grace every day, and that prison had given him time to see what he'd done. He said he wished he could undo it all, but knew he couldn't. I folded the letter and put it aside. Reading his words didn't bring closure. It didn't bring comfort either. It just reminded me of how far I'd come without him. I no longer needed his apologies to heal. They were too late. I placed the letter in a box with other memories I couldn't bring myself to destroy. Maybe one day I'd throw them away, but not yet. For now, I wanted to keep them as reminders of how much strength it took to rebuild. Sometimes, holding proof of the past helps measure how far you've moved beyond it. That night, I sat by the fireplace and thought about forgiveness. I wasn't sure if I could ever give it to him, not because I wanted to hold a grudge, but because forgiveness felt like releasing something that still had lessons to teach. His betrayal had broken me, but it had also built a stronger version of myself. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about saying it's okay. Maybe it was about saying, it's over. I decided that was enough. I didn't need him forgiven to move on. I just needed peace. And I already had that. The next few months brought new beginnings. The foundation launched its first public event, a charity walk named Steps for Grace. Families, volunteers, and supporters gathered with shirts printed with her name. The sight of hundreds of people walking together for something born from my pain filled me with overwhelming gratitude. I stood at the starting line, looking at the crowd, and felt tears well up, not from sorrow, but from pride. Grace's story had spread beyond me. Her name now lived in every step they took that day. After the event, donations poured in. The foundation gained recognition, appearing in local news for the work we were doing. People reached out from other cities, wanting to help. I realized then that this was no longer just my mission, it was becoming a movement. Grace's name had turned into a symbol of strength for others who had faced loss. I smiled, thinking about how she would have loved all the attention, all the laughter. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was living in her absence. I felt her everywhere. One quiet evening, as I reviewed some paperwork, I came across an old photo of Grace and her father. I had tucked it between files long ago. In it, he was holding her at the park, both of them smiling under the sun. I stared at it for a while, feeling a strange mix of emotions. The anger was gone, replaced by something softer. Time had done what revenge couldn't. It had healed. I placed the photo in Grace's memory book, closing it gently. Some memories didn't need to be erased. They just needed to rest. The following week, I visited the children's hospital, where part of the donation had gone. They had placed a plaque near the entrance with Grace's name engraved on it. I ran my fingers across the letters, feeling pride rise in my chest. A nurse told me how the funds had helped renovate a playroom for the kids. When I stepped inside, I saw bright colors, toys, and laughter filling the air. That was the moment I truly felt Grace's presence again. Her name wasn't tied to pain anymore. It was tied to joy. The next morning, I received another letter from him. This one was shorter. He said he had heard about the foundation and wanted to thank me for keeping Grace's memory alive. He wrote that hearing about it gave him hope to be a better person, even if the world never forgave him. I read it twice, then placed it in the same box as before. Maybe one day I would write back. Maybe I wouldn't. But for now, I hoped that if he had finally learned regret, it meant Grace had touched him too. The foundation continued to expand. We added counseling programs for grieving parents and partnered with schools to teach about emotional support for families in crisis. Every small milestone made me feel closer to Grace. Her laughter echoed in every success. Her warmth reflected in every act of kindness we inspired. The pain that once ruled my life had become something else entirely, a reminder that even from heartbreak, something good could bloom. Love hadn't died with her. It had only found a new way to exist. That realization gave me peace every single day. One day, while leaving the foundation office, I stopped by a small park nearby. It was full of children running, shouting, and chasing bubbles. Watching them brought back memories of Grace chasing her own. I smiled through tears, realizing that joy didn't have to be gone just because she was. I could still feel it, live it, and share it. I whispered her name softly as a bubble floated past me and disappeared into the sunlight. It felt like she was reminding me that life could still be beautiful. When the news came that he had been sentenced, I felt nothing. Not relief, not happiness, just stillness. It was finally official. His story was over. I didn't read the details. The punishment didn't matter anymore. He was living the result of his choices, and I had already moved beyond them. I closed my laptop, made tea, and opened my journal. I wrote down one sentence. Justice is complete. Then I closed the book and never wrote about him again. The chapter was done, sealed in ink, and I didn't need to reopen it. I spent the following days quietly. The world had moved on, and so had I. My house was filled with light again, the kind that used to make Grace laugh. I hung new curtains, planted flowers outside, and filled the rooms with photos that made me smile instead of ache. Healing didn't happen overnight. It came in slow, gentle ways. Every act of living, every moment of kindness, every breath without tears was proof that I was still here, still standing, still finding my way forward. Grace would have wanted that. I started taking photos again, something I hadn't done since before Grace got sick. At first it felt strange, like relearning how to see beauty, but soon I found joy in capturing small things. The sunrise over the park, kids riding bikes, the glimmer of morning dew on leaves. Each photo became a reminder that life still held meaning. I began printing them and hanging them around the house. It felt like covering old wounds with new colors. I wasn't escaping the past anymore. I was painting over it with love and light. One morning I received an email from a journalist who wanted to feature the Foundation's story. She said it had inspired hundreds of people online. I agreed to the interview. When she asked what motivated me, I told her the truth, that pain doesn't have to destroy you. It can teach you how to rebuild. I didn't mention him or what he did. The story wasn't about him anymore. It was about grace, about second chances, and about finding peace after losing everything. The article went viral, and donations doubled within a week. The success felt surreal. The same world that had once watched my husband's downfall was now celebrating my daughter's legacy. I realized how quickly life could shift from tragedy to triumph. If you refused to give up, people began writing to me, saying they found hope in Grace's story. I read every message with tears in my eyes. The pain had been transformed into light, reaching people I would never meet. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was surviving someone else's story. I was finally living my own. When I visited Grace's grave again, the air felt warmer, softer. I placed new flowers on the stone and sat down beside her. I told her everything: the Foundation's success, the families we'd helped, the people who now spoke her name with love. I closed my eyes and let the sunlight touch my face. For a brief moment, I felt something like contentment wash over me. I realized I wasn't talking to a memory anymore. I was talking to a legacy that still lived in every act of kindness her story had created. In the months that followed, I began mentoring others who had gone through similar loss. I spoke at community centers and support groups, sharing my journey. People listened, cried, and found strength in the story. Every time I stood in front of them, I felt Grace beside me. She had always been my reason to fight, and now she was the reason others found hope. The ache never fully left, but it no longer ruled me. It became a quiet reminder of love that had once filled my life completely. One evening, as I packed up event flyers for the next fundraiser, I saw a message from Eleanor. She congratulated me on the Foundation's success and said she had followed every step of the journey. Her words made me realize how many people had quietly supported me through the hardest times. Justice and kindness had come from unexpected places. I smiled, typing a short reply of thanks. Sometimes healing isn't a single moment. It's the slow recognition of how far you've come from the day you thought you wouldn't make it. The next weekend, I hosted a small dinner with my team and close friends. Laughter filled the room again, real and full. We toasted to grace, to hope, and to fresh starts. As I looked around the table, I realized this was what happiness looked like, not perfection, but peace. I didn't think of him at all that night. His story no longer occupied space in mine. What remained was love, resilience, and the quiet pride of knowing I had turned pain into something beautiful. That was the justice Grace would have wanted. That night, before bed, I walked through the house, turning off lights one by one. I stopped at Grace's photo on the mantel. Her smile was still the same, bright and full of life. I whispered that I was okay, that we were okay. Then I turned off the last light and stood in the quiet, feeling a calm I hadn't known in years. The story that began with loss had found peace. I had survived betrayal, grief, and emptiness, and built something stronger in their place. Grace had given me a reason to live again. The following spring brought more light into my life. The Foundation's second charity walk was larger than the first, with hundreds joining to honor Grace. Children carried balloons with her name, parents held signs of hope, and the air was filled with warmth. Standing at the finish line, I felt tears slip down my cheeks, not from grief, but from pride. Grace's story had become a symbol of resilience. For years I had lived in shadows, but that day, standing among laughter and sunlight, I finally stepped back into the world again. Later that week, a journalist reached out again, asking if I'd ever forgive my husband. I didn't hesitate when I said that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what happened. It was about freeing myself from its weight. She nodded quietly, understanding. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't a gift for him, but for me. I wasn't forgetting what he did, but I was done carrying it. His punishment was time, mine had been pain. Now, both were ending in their own way. I could finally live without the anger pulling me backward. I began traveling to speak about the Foundation. Hospitals invited me to share Grace's story. Schools asked me to talk about hope, and people reached out wanting to volunteer. Each time I stood before a crowd, I felt Grace beside me. I would tell them that pain can break you or build you, and I had chosen the latter. After every speech, parents hugged me, thanking me for giving them courage. I would always smile and tell them the truth. It wasn't me who gave them courage, it was love. The same love Grace taught me. One afternoon, while sorting through mail at the Foundation office, I found another letter from him. This one was different. It wasn't an apology. It was a confession. He admitted that before Grace died, doctors had told him about an experimental treatment that might have helped. He wrote that he hadn't told me because he was afraid to hope, afraid of being disappointed again. Reading that broke me in ways I didn't expect. Not from anger, but from the weight of what could have been. There had been a chance, however small, and he hid it. I sat there for hours, the letter trembling in my hands. I felt the old pain creeping back. Heavier this time. My mind kept repeating the same thought. What if? What if I had known? What if Grace had lived? I tried to push the questions away, but they stayed. I couldn't decide if I hated him more for lying or pitied him for being too weak to face the truth. His confession didn't undo the past. It only added another scar to a heart that had barely healed. I placed the letter aside, silently shaking. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the same letter, trying to understand why he wrote it now. Maybe guilt had finally caught up to him. Maybe prison walls made him see what mattered. Either way, it didn't change anything. Grace was gone. Nothing he said could bring her back. I folded the letter and tucked it away in the same box as the others. The box had become a grave for his words, ones that no longer had power over me. They were just reminders of the man he used to be. The next morning, I made coffee and opened my journal. I wrote down everything I was feeling, the shock, the sadness, the confusion. Writing had become my way of making peace with things I couldn't say out loud. As the words filled the page, the anger began to fade. I realized that what hurt the most wasn't his lie. It was the lost time, the what-ifs, that would never be answered. But I couldn't live there anymore. I had already survived one loss. I wasn't going to lose myself to another. For days I kept thinking about visiting him. I didn't know if I wanted answers or closure. Part of me thought it was unnecessary. Another part felt it might finally end everything. I discussed it with no one. This was something I had to decide alone. Eventually I realized it wasn't about him. It was about me. I didn't need his forgiveness or his guilt. I just needed to face the last thread tying me to that chapter of my life and finally cut it loose for good. I scheduled a visit at the prison and drove there on a cold morning. The road stretched endlessly, gray and quiet. My hands gripped the steering wheel as memories flooded in. Grace's laughter, his empty promises, my own tears. The drive wasn't long, but it felt like a lifetime. When I arrived, a guard led me through metal doors into a small visitation room. A glass wall separated the two sides, with phones hanging on both ends. I sat down, waiting for him to appear, unsure of what I would even say when he did. When he entered, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who once looked untouchable now looked tired and thin. His posture was slouched, his eyes hollow. He sat down across from me and picked up the phone slowly. For a moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. I lifted the receiver, my hand steady. Seeing him like this didn't bring satisfaction. It brought perspective. Power and pride had abandoned him. What sat across from me was not a monster, but a broken man living with the ruins he had built himself. He spoke first, his voice low and rough. I listened without interrupting. He talked about guilt, about sleepless nights, about Grace's laughter haunting him. His words spilled out like confessions, heavy and uncertain. When he said he didn't expect forgiveness, I believed him. His eyes held the truth, this time, stripped of lies. I didn't feel hate anymore. I just felt tired. I realized that I wasn't there to forgive him or punish him. I was there to let him know that he no longer had control over me. That was my closure. When he stopped talking, there was silence. I looked at him for a long moment before saying that I wasn't angry anymore, but I would never forget what he did. I told him that Grace's name now lived in hospitals and homes, in every child we had helped, and that he didn't get to be part of that legacy. His eyes lowered, and he nodded slowly. I could tell he finally understood. The silence between us wasn't cold anymore. It was final. We had both said what needed to be said, and that was enough. As the guard came to take him away, he looked back once, but I didn't. I placed the receiver back and stood up. My legs felt light, like I was walking out of more than just a room. The air outside was cold but freeing. I walked to my car, closed the door, and sat in silence for a while. For the first time in years, I felt completely untethered. The past no longer held me by the throat. I had faced it, spoken my truth, and left it behind those prison walls forever. Driving home, I realized that closure isn't always about answers. It's about acceptance. I didn't get everything I wanted from that visit, but I got what I needed: peace. As the city lights passed by, I thought about how different life looked now compared to the day of Grace's funeral. Back then, everything felt heavy, unbearable. Now it felt lighter. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant living without the pain being the loudest part of your story. For the first time, I truly understood what that meant. When I got home, I made tea and sat by the bay window, the same spot where I had planned my revenge months ago. But the person sitting there now was someone new. I opened my journal and wrote about the visit, about the strange calm that followed it. I ended the entry with one sentence: I am free. Then I closed the book and looked at Grace's photo on the table. Her smile seemed brighter somehow, as if she already knew what I had done. Maybe in some way, she always had. In the days that followed, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in years. The foundation continued to grow, and I threw myself into it completely. The more I worked, the more I felt Grace's presence around me. Her name was no longer tied to loss. It was tied to hope. I stopped checking old emails, stopped keeping track of headlines. My life wasn't about him anymore. It was about everything she had inspired. For the first time, I looked ahead without fear, knowing the best parts of her still lived on through me. I began focusing on new projects for the foundation: scholarships for children who had lost parents, programs for mental health support. Each one carried a part of Grace's legacy. The work filled my days and gave me purpose. At night, I would sit on the balcony, looking at the stars, wondering if she was somewhere among them, watching. I liked to believe she was. The grief never vanished completely, but it no longer consumed me. It had transformed into something gentler, something that reminded me that love outlasts everything, even loss. One weekend, I was invited to speak at a national event about grief and recovery. Standing on stage, looking at hundreds of faces, I felt my voice steady and strong. I spoke about grace, about betrayal, about rebuilding from nothing. I told them that healing isn't a straight path. It's 1,000 small choices to keep going. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. When I finished, they stood and applauded. I felt tears forming, but they weren't from pain. They were from gratitude. Grace's story had become everyone's story that day. After the event, several people approached me, sharing their own stories of loss. Some cried, Others smiled. One mother hugged me tightly and said my words gave her strength to keep living after losing her son. That moment reminded me why I started the foundation in the first place. It wasn't to erase grief. It was to show that life could still be full of meaning afterward. Grace had taught me that lesson. Now, through her memory, I was teaching it to others. It felt like the most beautiful full circle. That night, when I returned home, I sat by the fireplace again. The box of letters from him was still tucked away in the corner of the cabinet. For the first time, I opened it and took everything out. I read each one carefully, without tears or anger. They were just words now, empty and powerless. When I finished, I put them back, sealed the box, and placed it on a high shelf. I didn't need to burn it. I didn't need revenge. The past could stay there quietly, without owning me anymore. Spring turned into summer, and life found a gentle rhythm again. The foundation flourished, friendships deepened, and laughter returned to my home. I began taking short trips, places Grace had always wanted to see. I'd take her photo with me and snap a picture wherever I went. It felt like she was still traveling beside me, still exploring through my eyes. Each new place brought peace. I had spent years surviving the worst pain imaginable. Now I was learning how to live joyfully again, carrying her with me in every sunrise. One morning, while reviewing some documents, I received a letter from the prison. It wasn't from him this time. It was from a counselor. They said he had been helping other inmates, sharing his story about greed and loss. The counselor thanked me for visiting him, saying it had changed him. I didn't reply, but the letter stayed in my thoughts for days. Maybe Grace's light had reached even the darkest places. Maybe that was her final gift, to turn pain into lessons, even for those who caused it. I smiled softly at the thought. The following weekend, I hosted a memorial event at the hospital. Families gathered to honor the children they had lost. There were candles, music, and photos placed across a long table. I added Grace's picture among them, her bright smile standing out. As I looked around the room filled with shared sorrow and strength, I realized something profound. None of us were alone. Loss connects people in ways love never could. It teaches empathy, resilience, and grace. It shows that even through heartbreak, the human heart keeps finding ways to heal. When I went home that night, I made myself a cup of tea and sat outside on the porch. The sky was clear, filled with stars. I looked up and whispered a thank you to Grace, not just for being my daughter, but for being my reason to keep going. I told her that she had changed me, that she had taught me strength, forgiveness, and the meaning of love. The wind brushed gently against my face, and I smiled. It felt like her way of saying she heard me. That was enough. Lying in bed that night, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the loss, the rebuilding. The story no longer felt like tragedy. It felt like transformation. I had walked through fire and found something sacred on the other side. Peace. My life wasn't perfect, but it was real. Grace had given me that gift. Before falling asleep, I looked at her photo one last time and whispered that I loved her. My eyes closed easily, my heart steady. For the first time in years, I slept without the weight of yesterday. The morning light crept through the curtains, soft and golden. I stood by the window with my tea, looking at the world that once felt so heavy. The trees swayed gently, and the neighborhood was alive with quiet sounds of normal life. It struck me that peace doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds slowly and silently, until one day you realize it's already there. I whispered good morning to Grace's photo on the mantel. The house no longer echoed with pain. It felt like home again, filled with quiet strength instead of sorrow. That day, I decided to document the journey. I began writing a book, not for money or fame, but for healing. I wanted others to know that even the deepest wounds could close with time and courage. Each page carried pieces of my past, the betrayal, the grief, the strength I didn't know I had. I wrote about Grace's laughter, the foundation, and the moment I chose peace over revenge. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt. It was as if I was finally turning the last painful memories into lessons for others to hold. Weeks passed as the book took shape. Late nights turned into mornings filled with words that felt like closure. When I finished the final chapter, I didn't cry. I smiled. The story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about love that refused to die. I decided to title it Grace's Light. It felt right. Her name belonged there, shining at the center of every page. I sent the manuscript to a small publisher who had supported the foundation. They agreed to release it, saying it might help others find their way through grief. The book release day arrived quietly, without fanfare. I held the first printed copy in my hands, feeling its weight. On the dedication page, I had written, "For Grace, who taught me how to keep living." The moment felt sacred. I placed the copy on the bookshelf beside her, framed drawing of our family. It wasn't just a book. It was proof that from ruin, something beautiful could grow. I stood there for a while, the air still, the light soft, realizing that this was my true closure at last. The book began to spread beyond my town. Emails and letters arrived from strangers who said my story gave them hope. Some had lost children, others faced betrayal or loneliness. They said the pages reminded them they weren't alone. Reading those messages made me realize how pain connects people across miles and lives. Grace's story was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever fought to rebuild themselves. I often imagined her smiling somewhere, proud that her light was reaching hearts she never knew. One afternoon, I was invited to a national talk show to discuss the book and the foundation. Sitting under studio lights, I felt calm. The host asked if I believed in miracles. I said yes, but not the kind people pray for. Real miracles, I told her, are the ones we build ourselves: the courage to forgive, the strength to start again, the will to find peace after losing everything. The audience grew quiet, then applauded softly. I knew then that Grace's legacy had touched more lives than I could have ever imagined. After that interview, donations and support for the foundation multiplied. Hospitals reached out for partnerships, and even other charities wanted to collaborate. What began as a small effort born from grief had become a national movement of hope. I often thought back to the woman I had been on the day of Grace's funeral, broken, lost, and furious. She wouldn't have believed the woman standing here now. But healing has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, showing that even shattered hearts can rebuild into something unbreakable. As the years moved on, the foundation built its first children's recovery center. It was a bright, open place filled with laughter and art, not silence and sadness. We named it Grace's Haven. When I walked through its halls for the first time, I could barely breathe. Seeing children run and play in a place that existed because of her was overwhelming. I felt her spirit everywhere, in every smile, every echo of joy. It was as if Grace had come back, not in body, but in everything good that had blossomed from love. That evening, the mayor attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony. As I stood at the podium, I could barely find my words. I thanked everyone who helped make it possible, then paused, looking at the sky above. "This is for Grace," I said quietly, my voice steady. The crowd applauded, and for a brief moment, I felt something like her presence pass through me, a warmth that felt like sunlight from within. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was fulfillment. The journey that began in heartbreak had brought me here, to a moment of peace and pride. The next day, I visited the ocean. It had been years since I last stood on that shore, the same one where I once confronted my husband. The waves looked the same, but they sounded different now, calmer, kinder. I took off my shoes and walked along the sand, feeling the wind against my face. I thought about how much time had passed, and how much I had changed. The sea didn't frighten me anymore. It reminded me that life keeps moving, washing away pain but leaving behind strength. I whispered goodbye to my past. I stayed there until sunset. The sky turned orange and pink, the waves reflecting every color of the evening. I thought of Grace, wondering what she would have looked like now, how her laughter would have sounded as a teenager. The thought didn't bring tears anymore, just warmth. I picked up a small seashell, held it tight, and smiled. Life had taken so much, but it had also given me meaning in return. I placed the shell in my pocket and walked back slowly, each step lighter than the last. Back home, I sat by the window as night settled in. The house glowed softly with warm lights. On the wall hung photos of the foundation's events, the hospital wing, the new center, all bearing Grace's name. I realized then that her story would never fade because I had turned her memory into something alive. Every good thing I did carried her forward. The grief that once suffocated me had transformed into a promise to keep creating light where darkness once lived. That promise had become the heartbeat of my entire life. Weeks later, a school invited me to speak to students about resilience. Standing before rows of young faces, I told them that sometimes life will shatter you without warning, but the pieces it leaves behind can build something stronger if you let them. I told them about Grace, not the tragedy, but the light she left behind. When I finished, a girl raised her hand and said she wanted to help children when she grew up too. Her words made my eyes water. Grace's legacy was inspiring new hearts already. After the talk, the girl handed me a flower she had picked outside. A small white daisy. She said it reminded her of hope. I thanked her and tucked it into my notebook. Later that night, I pressed it between the pages of my journal beside Grace's name. I realized that the flower, fragile yet resilient, symbolized everything I had learned. Life isn't about avoiding pain. It's about finding beauty within it. The daisy stayed there, a quiet reminder that hope can bloom in even the most unexpected places. The next morning, I received an email from my publisher. Grace's Light had become a bestseller in its category. I sat there staring at the screen, speechless. It wasn't about fame. It was about how many people her story had reached. My eyes welled up as I thought of the woman I used to be, sitting alone in grief, unaware that the pain she endured would one day become a guide for others. Grace had taught me that tragedy doesn't define you, it reveals who you can become when you refuse to give up. The foundation continued to grow, expanding into new cities and forming partnerships with major hospitals. Everywhere I went, people recognized Grace's name. They told me how her story inspired them to rebuild their lives. Each time I would smile and tell them she was the true founder, not me. I was just the voice that carried her light forward. It was humbling to realize how far one little girl's love had traveled. Grace's legacy had become something eternal, something that lived in every heart it touched. That was her true immortality. One quiet night, as I sat by the fire, I heard rain tapping softly against the windows. The sound reminded me of the nights I had once cried myself to sleep, wishing for peace. Now the same sound brought comfort. I realized how time had rewritten the meaning of everything. What once symbolized sorrow now felt like calm. Healing doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. I leaned back in the chair, letting the rhythm of rain fill the room, and whispered, "Thank you, Grace." Her name no longer hurt to say. It felt like home. Years later, the foundation hosted a special anniversary gala. Families we had helped returned to share their stories. Children who had once been sick ran across the stage, laughing and healthy. I stood watching from the side, overwhelmed with pride. When they called my name to speak, I stepped forward slowly, the crowd's applause echoing around me. I began my speech by saying that this wasn't my success. It was Grace's. Every smile, every heartbeat, every life saved was because of her light. The audience stood, clapping, tears shining in their eyes. After the event ended, I stepped outside to breathe. The night was cool and still, stars scattered like silver dust across the sky. I looked up and whispered softly, "We did it." I imagined Grace somewhere beyond those stars, laughing the way she used to. In that moment, everything felt complete. The years of pain, loss, and struggle had led here to love that outlived death. I closed my eyes and felt her presence like a gentle breeze, knowing she was finally at peace, and so was I. When I got home, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat near the fireplace. The house felt warm and alive, filled with memories that no longer hurt. I took down one of the framed photos, a picture of Grace holding a balloon, her smile wide and fearless. I kissed the corner of the frame and placed it back carefully. I realized then that grief doesn't leave you, it evolves. It becomes love that has nowhere to go, so it finds new ways to live through the things you create. A few days later, I received a letter from a mother whose child had survived thanks to the foundation's funding. She wrote that her daughter had drawn a picture of an angel and named it Grace. Reading that made my chest tighten with emotion. It felt like the universe's way of reminding me that my daughter's story would never fade. Her kindness had rippled outward, touching lives she never met. I smiled through tears, whispering that Grace was still working miracles, one small act of love at a time. As years continued, the pain became just another part of my story, a scar, not a wound. The foundation stood strong, helping thousands. People often asked how I stayed hopeful after so much loss. I always told them the truth. Hope wasn't something I found, it was something I built. Every child we helped, every parent we supported, was another brick in the home that Grace left behind. Love had outlasted betrayal, compassion had outgrown anger, and in the end that was the most powerful victory of all. On what would have been Grace's 18th birthday, I organized a small ceremony at Grace's Haven. Families, children, and staff gathered in the garden to release balloons into the sky. As they rose, drifting higher and higher, I felt peace wash over me. I whispered, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," watching the colors disappear into the clouds. The crowd clapped softly, and I knew that wherever she was, she could see it. That moment felt like both an ending and a beginning, the closing of a painful story and the continuation of a beautiful one. That evening, I walked along the quiet street, back to my car. The air smelled of rain, the sky glowing faintly with twilight. I thought about everything: the loss, the love, the lessons. I realized that life is a circle of endings and beginnings, pain and purpose. Grace had given me both. Her absence had once broken me, but her love had rebuilt me into someone stronger, kinder, and whole. I no longer feared the past or the future. Both belonged to her light, and I carried it proudly wherever I went. Back home, I sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the horizon. The house was silent, except for the gentle hum of the night. I opened the window and let the cool air in. "We did it, Grace," I whispered. "You'd be proud." The wind rustled the curtains softly, almost like a reply. I smiled and closed my eyes. For the first time, there was no sadness, no pain, only peace. The story that began in grief ended in love. Grace's light still lived on, in me, and in every heart she touched.